Hey guys, I'm Jeremy and I'm here in Aspen, Colorado, and today I'm going to talk about the infamous Ted Bundy, one of the most deplorable humans to ever live. So he's not just famous because he had killed so many women, but his personality and persona in general was very unassuming. He was very intelligent, he was going to law school, he had plenty of girlfriends, he was into politics, and he could have been really successful. And so it's unusual why a guy would go on this mass killing spree, basically. And so the term serial killer didn't even exist until he committed these crimes. So in this video, I'm going to go through his background and some of the basic aspects of like the way he went about capturing these girls and doing these things. And I'm not going to go into every single case because there's over 30 women that are confirmed. Could be up to 36, and who knows, maybe killed 50 or even 100 people. So I'm mostly going to focus on Colorado. Here he killed at least 3 women that are verified and possibly a hitchhiker. And he also escaped from jail here. Not once, but twice. And one of those was in Aspen, which I'll go to in a little bit. So anyway, in this video, I'll go to the 3 crime scene locations, one of the areas where one of the girls was apparently buried, and then the area where he escaped from jail. So that would include Vail, Aspen, Snowmass, Rifle, Glenwood Springs, and Grand Junction. So Theodore Robert Cowell was born in 1946 on November 24th to an unwed mother in Burlington, Vermont. And after about 3 months, his mom decided that she would take him, and she brought him back to Roxborough, Pennsylvania, kind of near Philadelphia, where he would have stayed for the first few years of his life. And so here he actually stayed with his grandparents, and at that time in the 40s and 50s back in the day, it was very shameful for a woman to have a child out of wedlock. So they told him that his real mom was his sister growing up and his grandparents were his parents. And so it's a little unusual, but there's been other people that have been in this circumstance and didn't do these things. Eric Clapton, the legendary guitarist and musician, was in a similar situation, and he went on to make a few dozen songs, and this other guy went on to kill a few dozen women. So not a direct correlation there. So there's one story around the time he was 3 that his aunt awoke upstairs in her bed, and there were a bunch of knives pointed around her body, and that Ted was looking at her and like laughing or something. So that's pretty weird. Who knows if someone exaggerates a story like that. I've heard stories that his grandfather was abusive and like would grab a cat's tail and like swing it around and throw it against the wall and beat up his grandmother and possibly him. But I've seen other reports that he wasn't that bad. So the family encourages them to move out to Tacoma, Washington when Ted was probably just a few years old for like better job opportunities or whatever. So she moves out there, and then after a couple of years she ends up marrying this guy, Johnny Bundy. And so Ted ended up taking his name at that time, and then they ended up having 4 other kids. So there was 5 of them, and there was nothing about any like mistreatment from the stepfather or anything. He was included with everything like any other kid in the family, so nothing unusual there. Some of the kids in the neighborhood said he was a big bully and that he had like burned a cat and even dug a hole and made like punji knives, so if someone fell into the hole they could get cut. So I don't know if that's verified, but it seemed like he was a pretty rotten kid. He also admits at a certain point that he was kind of shy and introverted as he got older. But I also read other accounts where it says that he was somewhat popular and was a medium fish in a big pond. His only big sport that he got into was downhill skiing. He had stolen some skis and forged lift tickets, and even stole a car or 2 in high school, which he got arrested for, and I think later they scrubbed it off his record. But you could see that early on he was developing some antisocial behavior basically. And he would also go around the neighborhood and he was a peeping Tom. And so he would look into girls' windows. And he was also into these like detective magazines that were like quite brutal to women, like guys who would commit these crimes, and there was like brutal attacks on women. And he had gotten into porn and things like that around this time. So he graduates high school in 1965 and briefly enrolls in the University of Puget Sound for a semester or two, and then he transferred to the University of Washington. And there he actually studied Chinese, which is kind of interesting because I'm sure that wasn't like super popular back then. So it was during this first year that he had his first girlfriend, Diane Edwards. There's a couple different names they used for her. And she was more upper class and was beautiful, and he kind of came from a, lower class background. So this was a super big deal for him. And after about a year or so, he had dropped out of university and wasn't doing too much with his life and didn't have much direction. And so she ended up dumping him, basically. And so for Ted, this was a huge deal. He was absolutely devastated. I mean, I'm sure everyone goes through this kind of thing, right? It's your first girlfriend or boyfriend, and you're young, and of course it's going to be a big deal. And so around that time, he ended up quitting school, and he had a bunch of different part-time jobs. And then he even worked on a lot of political campaigns for the Republican Party, for like Rockefeller's presidential campaign, another guy who was running for lieutenant governor, etc. So for several years, he was big into Republican politics. So at some point during this time, he took a road trip out to the East Coast, stopped to see some family along the way, and he apparently stopped in Burlington, Vermont, and that's where he found out that his so-called sister was his mom. And so he was really also devastated by that. Like I said, it's definitely kind of a weird thing, but I mean, by this time it's the late 60s and it's like freedom and love. It's not like that would be such a huge stigma for that period of time anymore. He briefly went to Temple University for a semester in Philly before headed back to the West Coast. And there he re-enrolled at the University of Washington. And this time he was going to study psychology. And it was around this time he met Elizabeth Kloepfer. I'm not sure if I said that right. And that was probably one of his longer girlfriends. They dated for 7-8 years or so. She was a single mom. She had a 3-year-old. So Ted basically acted as a father for the kid until she was like 8 years old or something. And in general, he had some good behavior and did some good things. But the girl did mention when she was older that he did some inappropriate things, like they'd be playing games and he'd touch her inappropriately and put her in a situation where she could have drowned. So he did some like kind of evil things there too. But in general, besides this girl Liz, he dated several different women over the next 5 or 10 years, and even got married like while he was in prison and had a kid later on. So it wasn't like he was an incel and he wasn't like having any sex or anything like that. He definitely had several different relationships going on at the same time. Up here at the top of Aspen Mountain here. And so in the early 70s, it actually also worked as like a suicide prevention line. So he'd like take calls for people who might be committing suicide. And so he's supposedly very helpful there. And he even worked on another committee that worked with like domestic violence and rape. So in a way, this is good because later on when people think he might be a subject, they're like, no, this guy can never be. Like he's working on suicide prevention. He's working on political campaigns. And so around that time, he applied to law school in Seattle and he got accepted and started attending. And that's when he tried to rekindle a relationship with the first girlfriend. And so by then, Ted had matured quite a bit in those few years. Like I said, he was already accepted to law school and he had much more ambitions in life. So this girl was quite attracted to him at that point, and they started dating again. And they were even possibly going to get married. And then he just completely shut her off, like just totally cut her off. And she finally got a hold of him about a month later. She's like, what's going on? Like, we were like getting back together and suddenly you disappeared. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. So of course he did that to get back at her so that he was on top, right? He wasn't the one dumped. He was the one ultimately dumping her. So obviously an evil, vindictive thing to do, but that's obviously how this guy is. So in 73, he starts going to law school. And so it was in January of 1974 that all of this stuff really started kicking off, where about once a month a girl turned up missing. So although the big murder sprees began in 74, there might have been some stuff before. Later he admitted that he did his first kidnapping in 1969 in Ocean City, which I think he's talking about New Jersey or somewhere on the East Coast, but didn't kill anyone until 1971 in Seattle. But by 1974, he considers himself like a mature criminal and predator. And besides all these murders, as I mentioned, in high school, he had stolen ski equipment and stole cars. Well, throughout his whole 20s, it was the same. His girlfriend Liz mentioned how he'd come home with TVs and all this stuff all the time, and he said, "Don't tell anyone or I'll kill you," or something like this. And so he stole everything pretty much that he needed, whether it was a car, whether electronic equipment or whatever. So he's a big-time thief too, besides a murderer. And so in January 74, he makes his first attack on this woman, Karen Sparks, who was 18 years old, and she was left with permanent injuries. I think I read on her that the only reason why she thinks she lived is that her roommate next door was a guy who actually was talking in his sleep, and it had kind of spooked Bundy away from actually finishing the deed. And then in February was his first confirmed kill, basically, of Linda Ann Healy, who was a university student that was 21 years old. He hit her over the head and kidnapped her. And then he took her to a secluded area and then raped and murdered her, as he usually did. And then during that time, about once a month, a girl was disappearing. So it was a big thing around Seattle at that time. So before I go more into it, I'll give you the idea of what he was basically doing, generally speaking. So the one way he got women was that he would just kidnap them by like breaking into their home and dragging them out after he hit them in the head to his car and then escaping, or in an alleyway that was dimly lit, this kind of thing. But his main thing, I would say, or at least a good amount of these cases, he had a ruse. He would show up like in a cast or on crutches, and he would say, I'm injured. Can you help carry my books to the car? Or he would say, can you help carry my ski boots? Or can you help me get my boat onto my car? These kinds of things. So he would always appear like he was hurt in some ways, and a girl, naturally in most cases, wants to help, and they'll go over either to the door of his car or the trunk, and then he would take out a crowbar or a tire iron and hit them over the head and knock them out. And then he would drive away, and then when they would wake, he would strangle them or beat them up, and there's all kinds of things. And then the other thing he would do is he would impersonate like someone in authority. In one case, he said he was Officer Roseland, and he was a police officer, and there was a break-in in your car. Come with me in my car, blah, blah, blah. So he would act like he was a police officer or a fire chief or someone in authority, like asking, you need to come with me for some reason or some kind of thing. And then, of course, he met some girls like just at a bar, hanging out, and sometimes he would hook up with them so there was consent, and then he would like strangle them. But I would say most of them seemed to be either a ruse or he simply kidnapped them. So the first 6 girls or so that went missing were at nighttime. And then these next 2 were super bold because it was daytime. In July 1974, he goes to this lake, Sammamish State Park. There's thousands of people there. He's right in the main parking lot next to basically the beach and the lake. And he's walking up to different girls with a cast on his arm and saying, hey, can you help me like put my boat on the hitch of my car? And actually, the majority of girls don't actually help him because they know that there might be something wrong. And also, by the time they get near his car, they see there's no boat there, so that's really weird. But he eventually gets one girl to go help him, and of course he hits her over the head, brings her into the woods, and apparently killed her, or maybe just tied her up, Because in one instance, he originally said that she was still alive when he went back to the lake and basically fooled another girl into helping him. And he knocked her out and dragged her up into the woods nearby there, and had assaulted the woman in front of the other one while the other one watched. He later recanted that statement, but super brazen, because not only did he do it in broad daylight, he also said his name was Ted. So he used his real name, and people had seen his Volkswagen Bug. And so now you have, the guy's, what he looks like, his name, his age, and the vehicle. So by this time, he had actually gone down to possibly be down to the last 30 suspects on one list, and on another list, he was down on the top 100 possibilities. And even his girlfriend, either right then or later on, had contacted the police and told her that, my boyfriend's Ted, he's got all these weird things in my house, and he's gone for several days at a time when all these girls have gone missing, etc. They didn't really take it seriously, unfortunately, but it was also because all of these girls were calling in and saying it's my boyfriend or my ex-boyfriend. So there's quite a lot of information coming in, and unfortunately, they didn't think he did it because, as I mentioned, he's a law student, he had no criminal record, and he was involved in politics. And he just seemed overall a good guy in many people's eyes, so they couldn't think it was him. And so after he had tortured and killed these women, he would have other kind of unusual rituals and things. Sometimes he would wash them or even shampoo their hair. He would put makeup on them and dress them in different kinds of clothes. And the grossest thing of all is that he would go back several weeks later, and he was into necrophilia, which is basically having sex with corpses. And you can imagine, if you've ever smelled a dead animal or anything, it's absolutely disgusting. And human beings are the worst in the animal kingdom of any animal, because we have these unusual body odors to begin with. And when we die, all of this stuff comes out, and we have a weird diet, etc. So it's absolutely horrifying to imagine someone having sex with a very badly composed body. And he also, probably because he didn't want to take back the whole dead body, but he decapitated several of the women with a hacksaw and brought the heads back to his home as a trophy. And for many of those years, he was staying with his girlfriend Liz, and so he actually had skulls and heads in the home while his girlfriend was there. And in one case, he even burned one all the way down to ashes in the fireplace. So no doubt this guy was a really sick puppy. And so of course, after he had killed 9 or 10 women, including one woman in Oregon, he knew that people were hot on his trail, basically. He had stopped going to law school classes, which was his second semester, so he basically was failed out of law school his first year, but he got accepted to law school in Utah. And so he thought that was a good idea. I could leave town. And so he moved to Utah and started doing the same thing, basically, abducting and killing young girls. In this case, it wasn't college girls, though. It was actually high school girls. They were all 15, 16, or 17. And the fourth girl he went to attack or kidnap was this girl working at a mall named DaRonch. He made up this story of how he's Officer Roseland, and someone had broken into her car, and she needed to come to the station to file a report. And so she walks out, she thinks this is pretty odd. She sees that her car is there and didn't look like it was broken into, and he's like, come, you just have to fill out this paperwork. She gets in the car, they're going down the road, and she's obviously still really suspicious. And then she also realizes that they're not going to where the police station is. He's driving her out in the middle of nowhere. And she finally resists. There's a tussle in the car where he's trying to handcuff her while he's driving. And he stops, and she gets out and then gets picked up down the road by someone else. And that evening, he actually went to a high school which had a play going on. And when that ended, he kidnapped a young girl there. I think that girl was 17. And that was pretty much the end of his killing spree in Utah, for the most part. I think there was one more. And so that was his first semester, the second half of 74 that he did that. So now we're into January 75. He turns his attention to Colorado. And that's when he came out here over those next few months and abducted and killed 3 women here and possibly 1 hitchhiker. And so later, that's why he was out in jail out in Colorado, because the first woman he killed out here, they had found the body, and they had some evidence against him that they found in Utah to bring him back here. And how that happened was basically that he was driving erratically or something, as he did so often. That was most of the way that he got in trouble. He was driving erratically or going through a red light or a stop sign. And a guy went to pull him over and he took off. There was a short little chase, and basically he searched through his car, and in his trunk, it's basically like a burglary kit or a raid kit. He's crowbar, a pickaxe, a ski mask, handcuffs, all of this stuff you'd use for like breaking and entering or trying to kidnap someone. So they're super suspicious, and they bring him in for the arrest. They can't hold him, but they search his vehicle and they also search his home. And so they find all this incriminating evidence in his car, including his seat's gone as well. The front passenger seat's gone, which is super weird. And he had Polaroid photos in his car that they didn't find. If they found that, obviously, he would have been completely busted. And so when he got released later, he ended up destroying the photos. And then a month or so later, he actually ended up selling that bug. And unfortunately, that young guy who bought it for like $800 ended up losing it a couple weeks later when the FBI impounded it. I don't even think he got any money for that either, so that must have been a real huge bummer for that kid. And then they also go and check out his house, and they found that he had a magazine for Colorado, like places to go, hotels and things, and he had a check mark next to the Wildwood Inn, which is where his first victim was abducted from in Colorado, so that was really suspicious. And there was also a brochure for a school play of one of the girls that was abducted in Utah. And there was also tons of other unusual evidence in the house, like plaster of Paris, crutches, meat cleaver, and tons of unusual things. And so it's like super odd that all these things are going on, but they can't detain him, and so they release him on his own, but he's monitored super heavily from this point on. And I think that was pretty much the end of his killing spree for the most part. In the western states, at least. And then, of course, a few years later, when he escaped from jail, he went down to Florida and killed those few girls there as well. And so on October 2nd, they put him on a lineup, and DaRonch, the girl who was kidnapped, picked him out. And so he's arrested for the kidnapping, and they don't have enough evidence to charge him for the other girl taken from the high school, but they could definitely get him on kidnapping. He's out on a $15,000 bail. He goes back up to Seattle for the next few months. So in February 1976, Bundy stands trial for the kidnapping of Carol DaRonch. He waives his right to a jury trial because of the bad publicity, so it's a bench trial. The judge will decide. He gets 1 to 15 years, and so he goes to prison in Utah. And then he's in the Utah prison for about 13 months or so, and actually during that time, they found some plans that he had tried to escape at one point. And then Colorado submits paperwork to extradite him over here so that he could face the murder charge of Carlyn Campbell, who was his first victim in Colorado. And so he could have actually fought that a bit, but he didn't. And I think it's because the Utah prison he couldn't have got out of, and maybe in Colorado in some small town, it could be better for him, which is the case. And so now let's check out the prison that he escaped from, which is literally right behind me right now. It's actually the back he had jumped out, so I'll head over there. And so I think a lot of people have a little bit of a misconception, including myself, about the 2 jail escapes and the actual locations and what went on here. So what happened was, like, I had assumed he was in Aspen first for, like, let's say several months, and then he escaped, and then they put him in a different prison in Garfield County in Glenwood Springs, and then he escaped from there. But he was actually in Glenwood Springs at that Garfield County jail basically the entire time. He only came up to Aspen just for, like, the trial. So it wasn't like he had been staying here several months and he was in the library like often. And so he had just come up here that morning, apparently. Like, I don't even think he had spent a night here. And also people assumed that that library was like a separate room. It wasn't. What it was the judge and the lawyers and everyone's up front. Behind them are all the people who could observe the court. And behind them, there was a library. So it's all the same room. And so it was actually during recess, when everyone had left for a few minutes, that he walked back to where that library was. And that's when he jumped out of the second-story window. And then he ran up the road to go up to the mountain. I just took that gondola up, basically. And what he did was he tried to go to Crested Butte, which is a town south of here, which you only could get from hiking. It's about 15 to 20 miles. And there's actually hiking trails that are really popular through there. It's one of the most beautiful areas in the whole state. And so he had gone up and broken into a cabin the first night, and then over the next few days was trying to get over to Crested Butte. And when he escaped, it was mid-June, which is almost the time I'm here right now. This is like the third week of June. And you could even look on all trails of the hiking trails around here, and there's a pass, West Maroon Pass, that still has a ton of snow. Like, you'd assume by June you could easily get through, but it's not the case. Like, there could still be like several feet of snow, and people even mentioned those comments, like, you can't get through now unless you have like an ice axe and all this equipment, even the third week of June. So even if he was able to get over there, like, there's honestly a good chance he could have lost his life. And how awesome would that have been? Or could you imagine if he was like attacked by a bear? Like, what a perfect ending to a story that could have been. Escape from jail, killed by a bear, or frozen out there. It would have been perfect. But so anyway, he wasn't able to get over there. Although he did have maps, he probably needed a compass or some more information, and he's all disorientated. He sprained his ankle when he jumped out, and he was all tired, didn't have enough food, etc. He actually managed to steal a .22 rifle, but he had left it at some point, and he finally came into town like 6 days later at about midnight or so. And actually, in one report I saw, and I haven't seen this like big news or a lot of articles on this, he did assault a woman at like 1 a.m. apparently, or someone did. And she was able to get away, probably because he was so tired and everything after, 6 days. He had lost 15 pounds. And so he stumbles into town, he steals a car like usual, and if he drove actually correctly, it wouldn't have been too bad. He might have been able to like go around some of the cars, but he was like veering again as usual. And so a couple guys found him, and those two cops who even stopped him admitted that their police cars at that time were all super old and super bad. Like, they literally couldn't go over 30 miles per hour. Like, he could have probably outran them. Now, there was a roadblock in a couple of those streets, so he might have gotten stopped there. But anyway, he stopped. He was tired. He didn't fight or anything, and they brought him back into jail at that point. And so I think it is the second window over here that he jumped down. Now it has a bunch of stairs here, but that wasn't there before. So that's a long jump. He's lucky he didn't break his leg. He probably climbed down a little bit. So if he had kind of lowered down and just let go of his hands, that would have been not quite as bad, but regardless, that's super high. And yeah, it was funny because, a guy was driving by here and had seen someone jump out of the window. And so he walked up to the front and he's like, "Is it normal for people to jump out of windows out of these buildings?" And they're like, "Oh, damn." And they ran upstairs. They're like, "Oh, he jumped out of the window." So they obviously kept him in the Garfield County Jail up in Glenwood Springs after that. And several months later, or a year, he had escaped from that one too. I'll go into that in a little bit more when I go over there. So now I'll head over towards Snowmass Village, which is where he committed his first murder in Colorado, of Carlyn Campbell. She was here with her fiance, who was actually a doctor and had 2 kids from like a previous marriage. He was in his, I guess, late 20s, early 30s, and she was in her early 20s, and they were planning on spending 5 days out there to like learn how to ski or go skiing in general. And so that was actually only her second day in Colorado when she was abducted. And so he must have been skiing in town that day because he was a huge skier. That's like was his favorite thing to do, and he probably finished skiing because she came back to that hotel around 6 o'clock or so. So here at the Wildwood Inn, and they were hanging out down there in the lobby with her fiance and the 2 kids, and a bunch of other doctors were here. And she went up to get a magazine, and she never got the magazine. So we know that he got her before then. And so I'm not sure if he was parked behind there or there's another parking lot down over there, but it was probably somewhere around back, I'm guessing. So he was down here at the pool, and you know, the rooms are right next to here on all sides. So he basically was just asking random people to help him get his skis or his boots into his car. But basically this is the second floor of the ground here, and then you just go up to where the cars are there. So these are the lower 200 numbers. So I think it might have been this hallway, but they changed all the numbers. So I know her one, I looked online, they changed that. It doesn't exist. I think maybe it was 205, so there's no 205 here. Here's where the elevator is, where she would have come out. So maybe she came out right there. I know she saw a few colleagues, like other doctors she knew and she briefly talked to. And then there's the pool. So I'm guessing maybe he was even standing here. He's like, hey, how you doing? You know, can you help me? I just need some help. And she's like, oh, sure, I'll come down. And then she probably walked back this way. Or her room was even on this side.
See you.
And it's going up to the back parking lot. And so she probably came up here, and you've got a parking lot with a few cars here. And even over here, someone could park. Or where I parked is just, 100 feet up over there, but it was already dark. So I don't know if he'd risk go all the way far, but yeah, I mean, it seems like if he did it here, other people might walk out and see something. So maybe the parking lot was a little bit of a better idea. And who knows too, if this big building behind me at condos, if that was even there 50 years ago, right? That could have even been a parking lot. But you got this other one right here too. Yeah, so he could have just walked up to, let's say his car is right around here, right next to that hotel, and popped her over the head at the other girls, and that was it. So anyway, I'll drive up to where he left her body later that night. So I just drove up Owl Creek Road. This is halfway to Aspen. And some of the road around here was kind of flat, so it wouldn't be a good place to toss someone on the side of the road. But here there's a big kind of ditch to the right. So I imagine it wasn't easy to find. So I imagine 50 years ago, there wasn't that bike trail down there. It was probably just a forest here. And yeah, he had dumped her on the evening of January 12th, probably, pretty late. This road probably didn't have too much traffic late at night. And yeah, it would have been hard for him just to pull over for a second, see that there were no headlights coming or anything, and toss her in here. And then by mid-February, one of the workers in this area was driving by and seen all these birds in the area that were circling around over here. And she's like, oh, what's going on? So she stopped here and kind of looked over the snowbank there, and she'd seen the naked body of Carlyn Campbell. So really tragic. The only good thing was at least they found her, whereas the other 2 women that he killed in Colorado, they didn't find. So now I'll head out to Vail, which is where Ted Bundy had his second victim in Colorado, Julie Cunningham. So I'm out here at the Apollo Park Apartments. This is where Julie Cunningham was living. So it was here in March 15th, 1975, that she encountered Ted Bundy on the road. He had that ruse where he basically said, "Can you help me with my ski boots?" And she helped him, and unfortunately was abducted and taken away. So Julie was a ski instructor and worked at a sports store here in town. And she had just gone off to meet a guy she was dating in Idaho, and she was hoping they would get closer, possible marriage. And the guy just basically wanted a short-term relationship with her. So she was devastated. She came back to Vail, and she'd been talking to her mom on the phone that day. And then she had planned to go meet a friend at one of the taverns here and kind of discuss the situation. So she's already down in the dumps, and she left this apartment to walk down the road. I think it's about a half a mile, a 10-minute walk to the bar area. And that's when, somewhere on this road, Ted had asked if she could help him bring his ski boots to his Volkswagen Bug. And that's when he hit her over the head and abducted her. And really bad things. I mean, he would basically attack someone and strangle them. And then an hour or two later, she might wake up and try to escape, like run out of the car where they were parked. And then he'd tackle her and strangle her again. And so just really tortured her and other victims. So just really horrific stuff. And I read in some reports that she might have even met him in the bar, like the night before or something. So they might have had some rapport, and he had seen her going down the road. I'm not sure. But he said in his interviews that he did the ruse where he asked her for help, basically. So I'll kind of go down the road a little bit here and check out where those bars were. So she was probably coming down here on Gore Creek Road. You take the main road, take a left and come down here, and then past me around the corner is where the downtown is and some of the bars. So he probably was parked outside one of these chalets or hotels, and just asked her for help, and then kidnapped her here and brought her over to Rifle. So yeah, crazy. She's going out there, thinks she's gonna meet her friend and try to feel better after breaking up with that guy, and she got tortured all night and murdered. So yeah, super tragic. In these kinds of towns, this is like the last place in a million years you think anything bad would happen, because ski resorts are just where like rich people hang out. So there's not actually much crime in these kinds of places. So, because most of these girls think, yeah, it's just like a wealthy guy and he just needs a little bit of help with his ski boots, no big deal. But he was one of the most evil people in the world. I'm not sure which bar she was going to, but it was probably somewhere around here, around the corner. It probably doesn't even have the same name anymore anyway. So I'm headed out now to where Julie Cunningham was apparently buried right before Ted was executed. He mentioned where she was, or at least sometime before he was executed. And so he said he took her west over towards the town Rifle, and he went north up towards a mesa and past a small lake and stopped at like a circle or a roundabout with a few juniper trees. So I was kind of studying Google Maps, and quite a lot of people think it's this pretty big reservoir just north of town, a few miles. And it could be that, but that's actually kind of at least to me, it'd be kind of a big lake. It wouldn't strike me as a small one. Now, of course, Ted lived out in Seattle for years, and there's huge lakes and the ocean's next door, and so maybe to him that seems small. But I didn't think he would go up there, mostly because that's like a main route. And even up past that lake is Rifle Falls, which even back then was a famous tourist attraction. I'd seen that about a year and a half ago. And so I was thinking he wouldn't go like 25 minutes or a half hour north. He might stay closer to town. And just west of town, there was like a little lake there. And there were some trees in that area. So I'm going to check that out. Because most of the other parts around is pretty dry. There's not too many trees out like that. So he might have been over there, or he might have been above that big reservoir. That road goes off to the west, it goes off to the east, and there's like a big campground up there now. There could have been like a roundabout, it could have been more remote, I have no idea. I mean, this is 50 years ago, right? So I'll be there in a few minutes and go down that road first. So that looked like a little lake back there. I mean, it's really like a pond, but the road I was gonna take that I planned was over off there. It was closed. And some of these roads might be too rugged to get his Volkswagen Bug or whatever you had. But yeah, I mean, it could be anywhere out here. Like, this is all just basically a desert. It's all like for off-roading now. And there's juniper trees here and there. So it's kind of tough to say. And he might have been lying anyway. I mean, he said this, I think, right before he's executed, right? So yeah, who knows? And actually, it's interesting. I was reading some blogs and things online about this case, and one of the guys who either did a documentary or wrote a book about it chimed in on this subject. And most people would assume that the parents would want her to be found. And actually, they think they know the area where it happened, but they did decide they wanted to leave her there. So it's often where people are like, oh, I want to get them back or something. But the thing is that if Ted confessed this right before he died, I mean, that was already, what, 15 years after she went missing? Because that was 89, she was missing in like 75. So they just don't want to like open a can of worms. There was so much media and people around and so much stuff for so many years, and then, so I think they just decided like, leave her at peace out here somewhere. So yeah, it was definitely crazy. Came out here probably, I don't know, the day or night, and yeah, tortured her, and then came back a few weeks later to like hang out with her again. And I guess that's when he buried her somewhere. So anyway, I'll head up now to Grand Junction. That's where Ted had his third victim, Denise Oliverson. And I guess he had like grabbed her off her bike or something. The bike, it was found under this bridge. So it's the only time I think he did something like that to an actual cyclist. But anyway, I'll cruise over there. I don't know, that's an hour or hour and a half or something. Yeah, pretty creepy out here, no doubt. So I'm here in Grand Junction, and it was here on April 6, 1975, that Denise Oliverson had a little fight with her boyfriend and ended up taking a bike ride that afternoon to her parents' place, and she disappeared. So she was coming from here. It's kind of weird, they have like a shed in front of the house. I guess they don't want to be seen. And the river's next door here, really quiet neighborhood. And now I'll head over towards where she had her encounter with Ted Bundy. So she would have gone over that bridge I went over. And actually, initially when I heard of a bridge, I assumed she was found near the water there, back like quarter mile. But it was this other viaduct or bridge that goes over the railroad tracks. So of course, in the last 50 years, I'm sure a lot of these roads have changed. Like that bridge, I'm sure, was just a small 2-lane bridge at that time. And because the population then was probably 5 times smaller. But there is, like, here you could see like a path coming off, so you're not riding on like the main road. But anyway, she was found below this bridge here. So he was probably parked somewhere near here. And I'm not sure like if he would have like seen her or maybe been following her. It was April, so that's not even that warm for biking. That's pretty cold up here still, but so it's not like there's like a lot of people biking around. At least I don't think so. I know he had come from Golden like the day or two before, so he was coming back across Colorado, probably on his way to Utah, and probably just stopped in town, maybe got food, and then kind of looking out, just seeing if he could find someone. So I'm guessing he like parked somewhere like here, like seen her coming and parked, and probably pulled out a couple maps. And he's like, hey, excuse me, can you help me with some directions? Or he said something like his car was broke down. And she's like, oh yeah, I could help you. And then she's looking at the map, and then he probably hit her over the head. But they found her bike here, and her sandals were here. And there's no people around anywhere close. So this would actually be a good location. And then he brought her about 5 miles west on the Colorado River. So I'll cruise over there now. And of course, her boyfriend had just kind of fight with her, so everyone assumed it was him at first, obviously. But it wasn't, of course. And they wouldn't have found that out until Ted confessed in '89, so that's 14 years later. They had no idea what happened. Definitely pretty eerie, though. So this is about 5 miles up the road or so. There's this park here. And so obviously, I don't know where he went, but this is basically the main road, which goes next to the river. And then the I-70 also goes by the river towards Utah. And you can imagine he pulled off somewhere off this road, and that water's rolling. So it's the end of June now, so this is when it's the busiest rain, especially last night. I was driving, you could see in that footage that it's crazy storms yesterday. So in April, it wouldn't have been that bad, but I mean, you could still see it's a huge river. I mean, she would go off. She's somewhere in Utah. Pretty crazy. What a sick dude. So anyway, now I'll head towards where the end of the story is, which is the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs. That's where Ted had his infamous escape and then went to Florida and committed the last murders before he was incarcerated and eventually was executed. So I'm here in Glenwood Springs at the Garfield County Sheriff's Office. It was here back 50 years ago that Ted was for, I don't know, about a year or so. And I think this is a newer building. I think the original one was tore down, so this was made, I don't know, the last 30, 40 years. I guess after the embarrassment of the second escape of Ted Bundy, they probably figured they'd get a little bigger budget for that. So as I mentioned, he escaped out of Aspen in June, and then they brought him here. And he escaped out of here 7 months later at the end of December. So while he was here, during that year in general, he lost a bunch of weight, and he basically removed, there was like a light fixture, and he was able to somehow cut that with like a hacksaw or something, and he eventually got through. And so the ironic thing is that during his time in Colorado and in general, a lot of the evidence was getting thrown out. Like he stood a chance of an acquittal because they hadn't found 2 of the bodies and a lot of it was circumstantial. So he probably should have stayed put, but I imagine he was afraid of going back to Utah or something like that. And so by the end of December, they granted his request to move his case out of Garfield County. and he was hoping for Denver, which I don't think Denver was like super liberal at that time, but the judge decided to move it to Colorado Springs, which definitely is not. It's a military town. So I'm sure he knew that if he's going to go to Colorado Springs, that he's going to get the death penalty, which they still had in Colorado until like 2020. And so his best chance is to get out of a small county jail, which is what he did. And so he knows this time of month, around December 30th, is when a lot of people are on vacation. So he ended up coming up through where his light was, through the air ducts or something, and got out in one of the jailer's rooms. And that guy was gone. He was out somewhere else. And he ended up using that guy's clothes, got into the streets of Glenwood Springs, and looking just like anyone else. And he stole a car again, as he always does. So many people at that time, back in the 60s, 70s, probably even the 80s, it was much safer times. So a lot of people left their keys in their cars, which, you know, pretty lucky for Ted Bundy. But one bad thing is that it broke down after like 20 minutes. So he ended up hitchhiking to Vail. He took a bus to Denver and then flew from Denver to Chicago and then took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I think it was like around then that they finally realized that Ted Bundy was gone. It was 14 hours later. And so, of course, it was a big panic, and they're like, he's gone. And he was already like in Michigan, basically. People had seen him in a tavern there. So then I think he stole another car, went down to Atlanta, left that, and took a bus down to Florida. And he probably had a lot of pent-up rage. And so he was only there for a week in Tallahassee, staying at a boarding house next to a university. And one evening, he got into a sorority house where a bunch of young women live, and he viciously attacked 4 of them. 2 were dead, a couple others severely injured. And then he went a few blocks up the road and did the same thing to another girl. Luckily, she survived, but had massive injuries too. And I think it was something like 3 weeks later, maybe, he had his last victim, which was a 12-year-old girl, Kimberly Leach. He had gone by, a middle school or whatever, and she had gone out to get something in maybe another building. I think she had just won an award. She was getting like a gown or something. And he, I think, grabbed her maybe, because someone had seen it happen. And he obviously did whatever with her then. And they found her body a few weeks later. And then around that time, 3 or 4 weeks later, he stole another car and was trying to go to Alabama at nighttime. And I think they were doing periodic checks of cars. And he was stopped. And he actually kicked the legs of the police officers out and ran. And the guy shot twice into the air, like warning shots, and then chased him down and got him. And Ted even mentioned to him, he's like, oh, I wish you would have killed me. And so his trial ends up going on, and he actually probably should have stayed up in somewhere like the Northeast, like Michigan or New York or somewhere, because eventually they got rid of the death penalty and more liberal. In Florida, it's no joke. Places like Florida, Texas in the South, no joke if you're committing vicious crimes like that. So he was facing eventually those 3 murder charges. And so with his big ego, he represented himself so he could be on TV, and all of these women and people were in the audience cheering for him. And of course, obviously many people did hate him as well, but some sick people out there that actually like this guy. And there's many reasons why you shouldn't be your own lawyer. For one thing, when he's cross-examining the victims, if the jury thinks he did it, and he's asking these questions, and he's acting like he might be enjoying that, like reliving the experience. So that's a bad thing in general. And so the one girl that got kidnapped a few years before, Carol DaRonch, testified, and then the other sorority girls testified that they had seen him. But one of the big things is that he had actually bit down into the buttocks of at least 1, if not 2 girls. So of course they're going to match his teeth with the bite marks, and it came out that it was identical. And so really bad move on him there if he actually intended on getting off, but I'm sure he doesn't even think of it. He's probably in a drunken rage or something like that. Also in his last case, when he was getting tried for the killing of Kimberly Leach, he used some weird law in Florida where you could actually propose to someone to get married in the court while you're doing like this trial. So I'm not sure exactly the law or whatever. And he was dating that lady, Carol Boone. And so he proposed to her like in the court. So just more drama there. And actually while he was in jail in Florida at that time, they were able to pay like the guards or whoever for like a little bit of free time in an extra room. And so he has a daughter that's, I think, about 2 years younger than me. I think she was born in 1982. So I wouldn't be as worried about a female out there, but if she's got any boys, I'd be like, I'd be a little nervous. So it was about 10 years later, in 1989, he finally got the electric chair, and people were definitely celebrating outside, which I don't really blame them. And those last few weeks, he's giving a little bit more information, especially in the last day or two, because he's trying to buy more time. And so he's like, oh, just give me more time. I'll give you information about all of the crimes I did. And they decided they're not going to do like more time for bones, ultimately, which is what it is. And I don't blame them, because if you do it for one criminal, you're going to have to do that for everyone. So guys, I figured I'd give some final thoughts on this whole thing with Ted Bundy and everything that happened, the nature versus nurture, etc. And so one thing to mention is that what a shame he didn't go off to Vietnam in a way. Not that I would want him to go about doing these things to women over there, but he got out of high school in '65 and the war was just starting around then. But they didn't start the draft till about '69. And he got a deferment because of either some injury or something. But boy, wouldn't that have been nice if like he was sent over there and like his first week he's on point and gets blown away? That would have solved a lot of problems. We'd have about 30 to 100 women possibly alive today. As far as the nature versus nurture, I didn't see anything so crazy in his life. Like, as I mentioned, Eric Clapton had a situation where he was told like his sister was his mother or something like that. I mean, the only thing possibly is like when he was in that orphanage for 3 months, no one really cared for him and he's like screaming out for mom. But I mean, I'm sure that kind of thing happens all the time, and like people don't all become serial killers because of that, or some abuse, or because his girlfriend broke up with him his freshman year. It's like, big deal, dude. That happens all the friggin' time. I think it's more of a nature thing. And if you look at evolution, it can explain a lot of the reasons why these kinds of things happen. And as we all know, there's big differences between men and women, because through evolution and millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years, they've had different jobs and roles. Women traditionally were caregivers, and men were out hunting and in combat a lot. And so people throughout history had a lot of nice things, I'm sure, that happened, where they had a nice crop, had a nice festival, had story time with their kids, and they also cracked people's skulls open, raped and killed all the time. The history of humans is in constant conflict. And so there were years where people were just farming and things were okay, or hunting and gathering, but a lot of it was very, very violent. And even up to very recent times in World War II or Vietnam or even in Iraq, you see rape was totally normal. I mean, if you look at the Japanese in China, in Nanjing, hundreds of thousands of people killed and raped. When the Russians occupied East Germany in World War II, it's possible there was up to 1 million people raped. And so this thing has been going on. I mean, since Greek times, they would take over an area, and these weren't just some privates and low-level guys committing acts. Like, this is like the commander saying, like, you know, we've won the battle and now we have our last job, which is to rape not just the women, the men. And so this kind of thing in history has been happening forever, and it's well documented. And the fact of the matter is, we only have, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years of written history for human beings, but we've been around, say, 250,000 years. And so what happened to all these other times in history? We don't really know, but I could imagine there was a guy with a club walking around, picking out women, raping them, and doing this kind of thing. And these people probably did enjoy it, unfortunately. And it's just like, when they interviewed Ted, like, why did he do it? And he's like, I enjoyed it. The sad truth is that if Ted Bundy was in a Viking battalion or some Greek or Roman legion 2,000 years ago, he might have been a hero. He would have been probably a clever colonel or a general out there and committing all of these crimes. And the thing is that he was doing it to his own team, meaning it wasn't the enemy, and in a much different time. And so we get certain genes through evolution that can make us great basketball players or singers or comedians or musicians and all these different things. But some of our dark and scary genes are out there too. And those experiences can come out in different people. And that's obviously what happened with someone like Ted Bundy and a lot of these guys in history who are doing all these things. And I'm sure there's much more people out there in general in the public that do have these urges, but they're able to hold them in, basically. Part of it's probably the reason they're afraid of jail or this kind of thing or whatever. But unfortunately with Ted, that wasn't the case. He had to get it out. And he didn't even have the courage to like go fight in a war or something like that. He attacks all of these innocent women, which, you know, he was like 30 years old when he was in Utah attacking like 15, 16, 17-year-old girls, you know, people like half his age. Never attacked or killed a guy. So just a complete coward. He had many other opportunities in life to do something that could have been productive. He could have dated many other women in his life, did BDSM or whatever kind of things to fulfill some of that need. But he's such a narcissist that because something in law school didn't go well, I know the second try he had for law school, and he said that the people there had some kind of intelligence like he didn't have. And him breaking up with that first girlfriend and then a few years later dumping her, it's just like he has to have his way like a little child. And because every girl in the world didn't like him, they all had to die. He had to have this fun, sick fantasy. And then that whole necrophilia thing is just an added layer of sickness. So he obviously had some mental illness when it comes to that, because that is just super, super weird. Another thing about safety for you ladies out there, you got to realize a guy like this, if he's saying he's got to like get help for like his boat or something like that, like he would already have a friend with him to help him. If he was already in a class, there would be someone to help him get his books to his car and different things. So if you are going to help someone like that, tell them, wait a moment, I'm going to come back with either my girlfriend or a guy friend. I wouldn't go alone with any dude anywhere like this. And so there's not a lot of good things that could come out of this Ted Bundy story. But as I've talked about this today, and I'm sure you've seen other videos and are aware of it, there are guys out there just like him all the time, preying on women in these vulnerable states, or like when they're drinking and leaving a club and they kidnap or hit you over the head. So you got to be careful out there. Most people are good, but not everyone. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy it, like it and subscribe. I'll also put a link down for Patreon. I got to start trying to at least get some donations, because a lot of these videos either get like demonetized or like limited ads. And so I'm spending hours and hours, or like here, I went out for a day and a half and 10 hours driving and get a hotel. And they're like, oh, sorry, you said this word we didn't like. There's one picture we don't like, so you're not getting paid, basically. So I'd appreciate that. I'll have some other interesting stories out of Western New York and maybe Cleveland and even Canada. So you guys can check that out soon, and I'll see you later. Take care.